Bruce Bogtrotter and the Cake. How can she get away with it? Lavender said to Matilda. Surely the children go home and tell their mothers and fathers. I know my father would raise a terrific stink if I told him the head mistress had grabbed me by the hair and slung me over the playground fence. No, he wouldn't, Matilda said, and I'll tell you why. He simply wouldn't believe you. Of course he would. He wouldn't, Matilda said, and the reason is obvious. Your story would sound too ridiculous to be believed, and that is the Trunchbull's great secret. What is? Lavender asked. Matilda said, never do anything by halves if you want to get away with it. Be outrageous. Go the whole hog. Make sure everything you do is so completely crazy it's unbelievable. No parent is going to believe this pig's tail story. Not in a million years. Mine wouldn't. They'd call me a liar. In that case, Lavender said, Amanda's mother isn't going to cut her pigtails off. No, she isn't, Matilda said. Amanda will do it herself. You see if she doesn't. Do you think she's mad? Lavender asked. Who? The Trunchbull? No, I don't think she's mad, Matilda said. But she's very dangerous. Being in this school is like being in a cage with a cobra. You have to be very fast on your own feet. They got another example of how dangerous the headmistress could be on that very next day. During lunch, an announcement was made that the whole school should go into the assembly hall and be seated as soon as the meal was over. When all the 250 or so boys and girls were settled down in the assembly, the Trunchbull marched on to the platform. None of the other teachers came in with her. She was carrying a riding crop in her right hand. She stood up there on center stage in her green breeches with legs apart and riding crop in hand, glaring in the sea of upturned faces before her. What's going to happen? Lavender whispered. I don't know, Matilda whispered back. The whole school waited for what was coming next. Bruce Bogtrotter! The Trunchbull barked suddenly. Where is Bruce Bogtrotter? A hand shot up among the seated children. Come up here, the Trunchbull shouted, and look smart about it. An 11-year-old boy, who was decidedly large and round, stood up and waddled briskly forward. He climbed up on the platform. Stand over there, the Trunchbull ordered, pointing. The boy stood to one side. He looked nervous. He knew very well he wasn't up there to be presented a prize. He was watching the headmistress with an exceedingly wary eye, and he kept edging farther and farther away from her with little shuffles of his feet, rather as a rat might edge away from a terrier that is watching it from across the room. His plump, flabby face had turned gray with fearful apprehension. His stockings hung about his ankles. This clot, boomed the headmistress, pointing the riding crop at him like a rapier. This blackhead, this foul carbuncle, this poisonous pustule that you see before you is none other than a disgusting criminal and a denizen of underworld, a member of the mafia. Denisian from the underworld, a member of the mafia. Who, me? Bruce Bogtrotter said, looking genuinely puzzled. A thief, the Trunchbull screamed. A crook, a pirate, a brigand, a rustler. Steady on, the boy said. I mean, dash it all, headmistress. Do you deny it, you miserable little gumboil? Do you plead not guilty? I don't know what you're talking about, the boy said, more puzzled than ever. I'll tell you what I'm talking about, you suppurating little blister, the Trunchbull shouted. Yesterday morning during break, you sneaked like a serpent into the kitchen and stole a slice of my private chocolate cake from my tea tray. That tray had just been prepared for me personally by the cook. It was my morning snack, and as for the cake, it was my own private stock. That was not boy's cake. You don't think for 1 minute I'm going to eat the filth I give to you? That cake was made from real butter and real cream. And he, that robber bandit, that safe cracker, that highwayman standing over there with his socks around his ankles, stole it, and he ate it. I never did, the boy exclaimed, turning from gray to white. Don't lie to me, Bogtrotter, barked the Trunchbull. The cook saw you. What's more, she saw you eating it. The Trunchbull paused to wipe a fleck of froth from her lips. When she spoke again, her voice was suddenly softer, quieter, more friendly, and she leaned towards the boy, smiling. You like my special chocolate cake, don't you, Bogtrotter? It's rich and delicious, isn't it, Bogtrotter? Very good, the boy mumbled. The words were out before he could stop himself. You're right, the Trunchbull said. It is very good. Therefore, I think you should congratulate the cook. When a gentleman has had a particularly good meal, Bogtrotter, he always sends his compliments to the chef. You didn't know that, did you, Bogtrotter? But those who inhabit the criminal underworld are not noted for their good manners. The boy remained silent. Cook! The Trunchbull shouted, turning her head towards the door. Come here, cook! Bogtrotter wishes to tell you how good your chocolate cake is. The cook, a tall, shriveled female who looked as though all of her body juices had been dried out of her long ago in a hot oven, walked on to the platform wearing a dirty white apron. Her entrance had clearly been arranged beforehand by the head mistress. Now then, Bogtrotter, the Trunchbull boomed, tell cook what you think of her chocolate cake. Very good, mumbled the boy. You could see he was now beginning to wonder what all this was leading up to. The only thing he knew for certain was that the law forbade the Trunchbull to hit him with the riding crop, that she kept smacking against her thigh. That was some comfort, but not much, because the Trunchbull was totally unpredictable. One never knew what she was going to do next. There you are, cook, the Trunchbull cried. Bogtrotter likes your cake. He adores your cake. Do you have any more of your cake you could give him? I do indeed, the cook said. She seemed to have learned her lines by heart. Then go and get it, and bring a knife to cut it with. The cook disappeared. Almost at once she was back again, staggering under the weight of an enormous round chocolate cake on a china platter. The cake was fully 18 inches in diameter, and it was covered with dark brown chocolate icing. Put it on the table, the Trunchbull said. There was a small table center stage with a chair behind it. The cook placed the cake carefully on the table. Sit down, Bogtrotter, the Trunchbull said. Sit there. The boy moved cautiously to the table and sat down. He stared at that gigantic cake. There you are, Bogtrotter, the Trunchbull said, and once again her voice became soft, persuasive, and gentle. It's all for you, every bit of it. As you enjoyed the slice you had yesterday so very much, I ordered the cook to make an extra large one all for yourself. Well, thank you, the boy said, totally bemused. Thank cook, not me, the Trunchbull said. Thank you, cook, the boy said. The cook stood there like a shriveled bootlace, tight-lipped, implacable, disapproving. She looked as though her mouth was full of lemon juice. Come on, then, the Trunchbull said. Why don't you cut yourself a nice thick slice and try it? What, now? The boy said, cautious. He knew there was a catch in there somewhere, but he wasn't sure where. Can I take it home again? He asked. Oh, can I take it home instead? He asked. That would be impolite, the Trunchbull said, with a crafty grin. You must show Cookie here how grateful you are for all the trouble she's taken. The boy didn't move. Go on, get on with it, the Trunchbull said. Cut a slice and taste it. We haven't got all day. The boy picked up the knife and was about to cut into the cake when he stopped. He stared at the cake. Then he looked up at the Trunchbull. Then at the tall, stringy cook with her lemon-juice mouth. All the children in the hall were watching tensely, waiting for something to happen. They felt certain it must. The Trunchbull was not a person who would give someone a whole chocolate cake to eat just out of kindness. Many were guessing that it had been filled with pepper or castor oil, or some other foul-tasting substance that would make the boy violently sick. It might even be arsenic, and he would be dead in 10 seconds flat. Or perhaps it was a booby-trapped cake, and the whole thing would blow up that moment it was cut, taking Bruce Bogtrotter with it. No one in the school put it past the Trunchbull to do any of these things. I don't want to eat it, the boy said. Taste it, you little brat, the Trunchbull said. You're insulting the cook. Very gingerly, the boy began to cut a thin slice of the vast cake. Then he levered the slice out. Then he put the knife down and took the sticky thing in his fingers and started very, very slowly to eat it. It's good, isn't it? The Trunchbull asked. Very good, the boy said, chewing and swallowing. He finished the slice. Have another, the Trunchbull said. That's enough, thank you, the boy murmured. I said have another, the Trunchbull said. And now there was an altogether sharper edge to her voice. "Eat another slice. Do as you're told." "I don't want another slice," the boy said. Suddenly, the Trunchbull exploded. "Eat!" she shouted, banging her thigh with the riding crop. "If I tell you to eat, you will eat. You wanted the cake, you stole the cake, and now you've got the cake. What's more, you're going to eat it. You do not leave this platform, and nobody leaves this hall until you have eaten the entire cake that is sitting there in front of you. Do I make myself clear, Bogtrotter? Do you get my meaning?" The boy looked at the Trunchbull. Then he looked down at the enormous cake. "Eat, eat, eat," the Trunchbull was yelling. Very, very slowly, the boy cut himself another slice and began to eat it. Matilda was fascinated. "Do you think he can do it?" she whispered to Lavender. "No," Lavender whispered back. "It's impossible. He'd be sick before he was halfway through." The boy kept going. When he had finished the second slice, he looked at the Trunchbull, hesitating. "Eat!" she shouted. "Greedy little thieves who like to eat cake must have cake. Eat faster, boy, eat faster. We don't want to be here all day, and don't stop like you're doing now. Next time you stop before it's all finished, you'll go straight into the chokey, and I shall lock the door and throw the key down the well." The boy cut a third slice and started to eat it. He finished this one quicker than the other two, and when it was done, he immediately picked up the knife and cut the next slice. In some peculiar way, he seemed to be getting into his stride. Matilda, watching closely, saw no signs of distress in the boy yet. If anything, he seemed to be gathering confidence as he went along. "He's doing well," she whispered to Lavender. "He'll be sick soon," Lavender whispered back. "It's going to be horrid." When Bruce Bogtrotter had eaten his way through half of the entire enormous cake, he paused for just a couple of seconds and took several deep breaths. The Trunchbull stood with hands on hips, glaring at him. "Get on with it," she shouted. "Eat it up." Suddenly the boy let out a gigantic belch which rolled around the assembly hall like thunder. Many of the audience began to giggle. "Silence!" shouted Trunchbull. The boy cut himself another thick slice and started eating it fast. There were still no signs of flagging or giving up. He certainly did not look as though he was about to stop and cry out, I can't eat any more. I'm going to be sick." He was still in there, running. And now a subtle change was coming over 250 watching children in the audience. Earlier on, they had sensed impending disaster. They had prepared themselves for an unpleasant scene in which the wretched boy, stuffed to the gills with chocolate cake, would have to surrender and beg for mercy, and then they would have watched the triumphant Trunchbull forcing more and still more cake into the mouth of the gasping boy. Not a bit of it. Bruce Bogtrotter was 3/4 of the way through and still going strong. One sense that he was almost beginning to enjoy himself. He had a mountain to climb, and he was jolly well going to reach the top or die in the attempt. What is more, he had now become very conscious of his audience and of how they were all silently rooting for him. This was nothing less than a battle between him and the mighty Trunchbull. Suddenly, someone shouted, "Come on, Brucey! You can make it!" The Trunchbull wheeled around and yelled, "Silence!" The audience watched intently. They were thoroughly caught up in the contest. They were longing to start cheering, but they didn't dare. "I think he's going to make it," Matilda whispered. "I think so, too," Lavender whispered back. "I wouldn't have believed anyone in the world could eat the whole of a cake that size." "The Trunchbull doesn't believe it either," Matilda whispered. "Look at her. She's turning redder and redder. She's going to kill him if he wins." The boy was slowing down now. There was no doubt about that, but he kept pushing the stuff into his mouth and with dogged perseverance of a long-distance runner who has sighted the finishing line and knows he must keep going. As the very last mouthful disappeared, a tremendous cheer rose up from the audience, and children were leaping onto their chairs and yelling and clapping and shouting, "Well done, Brucey! Good for you, Brucey! You've won a gold medal, Brucey!" The Trunchbull stood motionless on the platform. Her great horsey face had turned the color of molten lava, and her eyes were glittering with fury. She glared at Bruce Bogtrotter, who was sitting on his chair like some huge overstuffed grub, replete, comatose, unable to move or to speak. A fine sweat was beading his forehead, but there was a grin of triumph on his face. Suddenly, the Trunchbull lunged forward and grabbed the large empty china platter on which the cake had rested. She raised it high in the air and brought it down with a crash right on the top of the wretched Bruce Bogtrotter's head, and pieces flew all over the platform. The boy was by now so full of cake he was like a sack full of wet cement, and you couldn't have hurt him with a sledgehammer. He simply shook his head a few times and went on grinning. "Go to blazes!" screamed the Trunchbull, and she marched off the platform, followed closely by the cook. Lavender. In the middle of the first week of Matilda's first term, Miss Honey said to the class, "I have some important news for you, so listen carefully. You too, Matilda. Put that book down for a moment and pay attention." Small, eager faces looked up and listened. "It's the headmistress's custom," Miss Honey went on, "to take over the class for one period each week. She does this with every class in the school, and each class has a fixed day and a fixed time. Ours is always 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoons immediately after lunch. So tomorrow at 2 o'clock, Miss Trunchbull will be taking over from me for one lesson. I shall be here as well, of course, but only as a silent witness. Is that understood?" "Yes, Miss Honey," they chirruped. "A word of warning to you all," Miss Honey said. "The headmistress is very strict about everything. Make sure your clothes are clean, your faces are clean, and your hands are clean. Speak only when spoken to. When she asks you a question, stand up at once before you answer it. Never argue with her. Never answer back. Never try to be funny. If you do, you will make her angry, and when the headmistress gets angry, you had better watch out." "You can say that again," Lavender murmured. "I am quite sure," Miss Honey said, "that she will be testing you on what you are meant to have learnt this week, which is your 2 times table. So I strongly advise you to swat it up before you get home tonight. Get your mother or father to hear you on it." "What else will she test us on?" someone asked. "Spelling," Miss Honey said. "Try to remember everything you have learned these last few days, and one more thing. A jug of water and a glass must always be on the table here when the headmistress comes in. She never takes a lesson without that. Now, who will be responsible for seeing that it's there?" "I will," Lavender said at once. "Very well, Lavender," Miss Honey said. "It will be your job to go to the kitchen and get the jug and fill it with water and put it on the table here with a clean, empty glass just before the lesson starts." "What if the jug's not in the kitchen?" Lavender asked. "There are a dozen headmistress jugs and glasses in the kitchen," Miss Honey said. They are used all over the school." "I won't forget," Lavender said. "I promise I won't." Already, Lavender's scheming mind was going over the possibilities that this water jug job had opened up for her. She longed to do something truly heroic. She admired the older girl, Hortensia, to distraction for the daring deeds she had performed in the school. She also admired Matilda, who had sworn her to secrecy about the parrot job she had brought off at home, and also the great hair oil switch which had bleached her father's hair. It was her turn now to become a heroine, if she only could come up with a brilliant plot. On the way home from school that afternoon, she began to mull over the various possibilities, and when at last the germ of a brilliant idea hit her, she began to expand on it and lay her plans with the same kind of care the Duke of Wellington had done before the Battle of Waterloo. Admittedly, the enemy on this occasion was not Napoleon, but she would never have got anyone at Cruncham Hall to admit the headmistress was a less formidable foe than the famous Frenchman. Great skill would have to be exercised, Lavender told herself, and great secrecy observed if she was to come out of this exploit alive. There was a muddy pond at the bottom of Lavender's garden, and this was the home of a colony of newts. The newt, although fairly common in the English ponds, is not often seen by ordinary people because it is a shy and murky creature. It is an incredibly ugly, gruesome-looking animal, rather like a baby crocodile, but with a shorter head. It is quite harmless, but doesn't look it. It is about 6 inches long and very slimy, with a greenish-gray skin on top and an orange-colored belly underneath. It is, in fact, an amphibian, which can live in or out of the water. That evening, Lavender went on to the bottom of the garden, determined to catch a newt. They are swiftly moving animals and not easy to get a hold of. She lay on the bank for a long time, waiting patiently until she spotted a whopper. Then, using her school hat as a net, she swooped and caught it. She had lined her pencil box with the pond weed, ready to receive the creature, but she discovered that it was not easy to get the newt out of the hat and into the pencil box. It wriggled and squirmed like quicksilver, and apart from that, the box was only just long enough to take it. When she did get it in at last, she had to be careful not to trap its tail in the lid when she closed it. A boy next door called Rupert and Twistle had told her that if you chopped off a newt's tail, the tail stayed alive and grew into another newt 10 times bigger than the first one. It could be the size of an alligator. Lavender didn't quite believe that, but she was not prepared to risk it happening. Eventually, she managed to slide the lid of the pencil box right home, and the newt's was hers. Then, on second thought, she opened the lid just the tiniest fraction so that the creature could breathe. The next day, she carried her secret weapon to school in her satchel. She was tingling with excitement. She was longing to tell Matilda about her plan of battle. In fact, she wanted to tell the whole class, but she finally decided to tell nobody. It was better that way, because then no one, even when put under the most severe torture, would be able to name her as the culprit. Lunchtime came. Today it was sausages and baked beans, Lavender's favorite, but she couldn't eat it. "Are you feeling all right, Lavender?" Miss Honey asked from the head of the table. "I had a huge breakfast," Lavender said. "I really couldn't eat a thing." Immediately after lunch, she dashed off to the kitchen and found one of Trunchbull's famous jugs. It was a large, bulging thing made of blue glazed pottery. Lavender filled it half full of water and carried it, together with the glass, into the classroom and set it on the teacher's table. The classroom was still empty. Quick as a flash, Lavender got her pencil box from her satchel and slid open the lid just a tiny bit. The newt was lying quite still. With great care, she held the box over the neck of the jug and pulled the lid fully open and tipped the newt in. There was a plop as it landed in the water. Then it thrashed about wildly for a few seconds before settling down. And now, to make the newt feel more at home, Lavender decided to give it all the pond weed from the pencil box as well. The deed was done. All was ready. Lavender put her pencils back into the rather damp pencil box and returned it to the correct place on her own desk. Then she went out and joined the others in the playground until it was time for the lesson to begin. The weekly test. At 2:00 sharp, the class assembled, including Miss Honey, who noted that the jug of water and the glass were in the proper place. Then she took up a position standing right at the back. Everyone waited. Suddenly in marched the gigantic figure of the headmistress in her belted smock and green breeches. "Good afternoon, children," she barked. "Good afternoon, Miss Trunchbull," they chirruped. The headmistress stood before the class, legs apart, hands on hip, glaring at the small boys and girls who sat nervously at their desk in front of her. "Not a very pretty sight," she said. Her expression was one of utter distaste, as though she was looking for something a dog had done in the middle of the floor. "What a bunch of nauseating little warts you are." Everyone had the sense to stay silent. "It makes me vomit," she went on, "to think that I am going to have to put up with a load of garbage like you in my school for the next 6 years. I can see that I'm going to have to expel as many of you as possible, as soon as possible, to save myself from going around the bend." She paused and snorted several times. It was a curious noise. You can hear the same sort of thing if you walk through a riding stable when the horses are being fed. "I suppose," she went on, "your mothers and fathers tell you you're wonderful. Well, I'm here to tell you the opposite, and you better believe me. Stand up, everybody." They all quickly got to their feet. "Now put your hands out in front of you as I walk past. I want you to turn them over so I can see if they are clean on both sides." The Trunchbull began a slow march along the rows of desks, inspecting the hands. All went well until she came to a small boy in the second row. "What's your name?" she barked. "Nigel," the boy said. "Nigel what?" "Nigel Hicks," the boy said. "Nigel Hicks. What?" the Trunchbull bellowed. She bellowed so loud she nearly blew the little chap out the window. That's it, Nigel said. Unless you want my middle name as well. He was a brave little fellow, and one could see that he was trying not to be scared by the Gorgon who towered over him. I do not want your middle name, you blister, the Gorgon bellowed. What is my name? Miss Trunchbull, Nigel said. Then use it when you address me. Now then, let's try again. What is your name? Nigel Hicks, Miss Trunchbull, Nigel said. That's better, the Trunchbull said. Your hands are filthy, Nigel. When did you last wash them? Well, let me think, Nigel said. That's rather difficult to remember exactly. It could have been yesterday, or it could have been the day before. The Trunchbull's whole body and face seemed to swell up as though she were being inflated by a bicycle pump. I knew it, she bellowed. I knew as soon as I saw you that you were nothing but a piece of filth. What is your father's job? A sewage worker? He's a doctor, Nigel said, and a jolly good one. He says we're all so covered with bugs anyway that a bit of extra dirt never hurts anyone. I'm glad he's not my doctor, the Trunchbull said. And why, might I ask, is there a baked bean on the front of your shirt? We had them for lunch, Miss Trunchbull. And do you usually put your lunch on the front of your shirt, Nigel? Is that what this famous doctor father of yours has taught you to do? Baked beans are hard to eat, Miss Trunchbull. They keep falling off my fork. You are disgusting, the Trunchbull bellowed. You are a walking germ factory. I don't wish to see any more of you today. Go and stand in the corner on one leg with your face to the wall. But, Miss Trunchbull, don't argue with me, boy, or I'll make you stand on your head. Now do as you're told. Nigel went. Now stay where you are, boy, while I test on your spelling to see if you've learnt anything at all this past week. And don't turn round when you walk to me. Keep your nasty little face to the wall. Now then, spell right. Which one? Nigel asked. The thing you do with the pen, or the one that means the opposite of wrong. He happened to be an unusually bright boy, and his mother had worked hard with him at home on spelling and reading. The one with the pen, you little fool. Nigel spelled it correctly, which surprised Trunchbull. She thought she had given him a very tricky word, one that he wouldn't have learnt, and she was peeved that he had succeeded. Then Nigel said, still balancing on one leg and facing the wall, Miss Honey taught us how to spell a very long word yesterday. And what word was that? The Trunchbull asked softly. The softer her voice became, the greater the danger, but Nigel wasn't to know this. Difficulty, Nigel said. Everyone in the class can spell difficulty now. What nonsense, the Trunchbull said. You are not supposed to learn long words like that until you are at least 8 or 9. And don't try to tell me everybody in the class can spell that word. You're lying to me, Nigel. Test someone, Nigel said, taking an awful chance. Test anyone you like. The Trunchbull's dangerous, glittering eyes roved around the classroom. You, she said, pointing at the tiny and rather daft little girl called Prudence. Spell difficulty. Amazingly, Prudence spelled it correctly, and without a moment's hesitation. The Trunchbull was properly taken aback. Humph, she snorted. And I suppose Miss Honey wasted the whole of one lesson teaching you to spell that one single word? Oh, no, she didn't, piped Nigel. Miss Honey taught it to us in 3 minutes, so we'll never forget it. She teaches us lots of words in 3 minutes. And what exactly is this magic method, Miss Honey? Asked the headmistress. I'll show you, piped up the brave Nigel again, coming to Miss Honey's rescue. Can I put my other foot down and turn around, please, while I show you? You may do neither, snapped the Trunchbull. Stay as you are and show me just the same. All right, said Nigel, wobbling crazily on his one leg. Miss Honey gives us a little song about each word, and we all sing it together, and we learn to spell it in no time. Would you like to hear the song about difficulty? I should be fascinated, the Trunchbull said, in a voice dripping with sarcasm. Here it is, Nigel said. Miss D, Miss I, Miss FFI, Miss C, Mrs. U, Mrs. LTY. That spells difficulty." "How perfectly ridiculous," snorted Trunchbull. "Why are all these women married? And anyway, you're not meant to teach poetry when you're teaching spelling. Cut it out in future, Miss Honey." But it does teach them some of the harder words wonderfully well," Miss Honey murmured. "Don't argue with me, Miss Honey," the headmistress thundered. "Just do as you're told. I shall now test the class on the multiplication tables to see if Miss Honey has taught you any spelling at all in that direction, or has taught you anything at all in that direction." The Trunchbull had returned to her place in front of the class, and her diabolical gaze was moving slowly along the rows of tiny pupils. "You!" she barked, pointing at a small boy called Rupert in the front row. "What is 2 sevens?" 16, Rupert answered with foolish abandon. The Trunchbull started advancing slow and soft-footed upon Rupert in the manner of a tigress stalking a small deer. Rupert suddenly became aware of the danger signals and quickly tried again. "It's 18, he cried. 2 sevens are 18, not 16, you ignorant little slug," the Trunchbull bellowed. "You witless weed, you empty-headed hamster, you stupid glob of glue." She had now stationed herself directly behind Rupert, and suddenly she extended a hand the size of a tennis racket and grabbed all the hair on Rupert's head in her fist. Rupert had had a lot of golden-colored hair. His mother thought it was beautiful to behold, and took a delight in allowing it to grow extra long. The Trunchbull had a great dislike for long hair on boys, as she had for plaits and pigtails on girls, and she was about to show it. She took a firm grip on Rupert's long golden tresses with her giant hand, and then, by raising her muscular right arm, she lifted the helpless boy clean out of his chair and held him aloft. Rupert yelled. He twisted and squirmed and kicked the air and went on yelling like a stuck pig, and Miss Trunchbull bellowed, 2 sevens are 14! 2 sevens are 14! I am not letting you go until you say it!" From the back of the class, Miss Honey cried out, "Miss Trunchbull, please let him down! You're hurting him! All his hair might come out!" And well, it might if he doesn't stop wriggling," snorted the Trunchbull. "Keep still, you squirming worm." It really was a quite extraordinary sight to see this giant headmistress dangling the small boy high in the air, and the boy spinning and twisting like something on the end of a string and shrieking his head off. "Say it!" bellowed the Trunchbull. "Say 2 sevens are 14. Hurry up, or I'll start jerking you up and down, and then your hair really will come out, and we'll have enough of it to stuff a sofa. Get on with it, boy. Say 2 sevens are 14, and I'll let you go." 2 sevens are 14, gasped Rupert. Whereupon the Trunchbull, true to her word, opened her hand and quite literally let him go. He was a long way off the ground when she released him, and he plummeted to earth and hit the floor and bounced like a football. "Get up and stop whimpering," the Trunchbull barked. Rupert got up and went back to his desk, massaging his scalp with both hands. The Trunchbull returned to the front of the class. The children sat there, hypnotized. None of them had seen anything quite like this before. It was splendid entertainment. It was better than a pantomime, but with one big difference. In this room, there was an enormous human blob in front of them, which was liable to explode and blow someone to bits at any moment. The children's eyes were riveted on the headmistress. "I don't like small people," she was saying. "Small people should never be seen by anybody. They should be kept out of sight in boxes like hairpins and buttons. I cannot for the life of me see why children have to take so long to grow up. I think they do it on purpose." Another extremely brave little boy in the front row spoke up and said, "But surely you were a small person once, Miss Trunchbull, weren't you?" "I was never a small person," she snapped. "I have been large all my life, and I don't see why others can't be the same way." "But you must have started out as a baby," the boy said. "Me? A baby?" shouted the Trunchbull. "How dare you suggest such a thing? What cheek! What infernal insolence! What's your name, boy? And stand up when you speak to me." The boy stood up. "My name is Eric Ink." Miss Trunchbull, he said. Eric, what? The Trunchbull shouted. Ink, the boy said. Don't be an ass, boy. There's no such name. Look in the phone book, Eric said. You'll see my father there under ink. Very well, then, the Trunchbull said. You may be ink, young man, but let me tell you something. You're not indelible. I'll very soon rub you out if you try getting clever with me. Spell what? I don't understand, Eric said. What do you mean? What do you want me to spell? Spell what, you idiot? Spell the word. What? W-O-T, Eric said, answering too quickly. There was a nasty silence. I'll give you one more chance, the Trunchbull said, not moving. Ah, yes, I know. It's got an H in it. W-H-O-T. It's easy. In 2 large strides, the Trunchbull was behind Eric's desk, and there she stood, a pillar of doom towering over the helpless boy. Eric glanced fearfully back over his shoulder at the monster. I was right, wasn't I? He murmured nervously. You were wrong, the Trunchbull barked. In fact, you strike me as the sort of poisonous little pockmark that will always be wrong. You sit wrong. You look wrong. You speak wrong. You are wrong all around. I will give you one more chance to be right. Spell what? Eric hesitated. Then he said very slowly, it's not W-O-T, and it's not W-H-O-T. Ah, I know, it must be W-H-O-T-T. Standing behind Eric, the Trunchbull reached out and took hold of the boy's 2 ears, one with each hand, pinching them between her forefinger and thumb. Ow! Cried Eric. Ow, you're hurting me. I haven't started yet, the Trunchbull said briskly, and now, taking a firm grip on his 2 ears, she lifted him bodily out of his seat and held him aloft. Like Rupert before him, Eric squealed the house down. From the back of the classroom, Miss Honey cried out, Miss Trunchbull, please! Please let him go. His ears might come off. They'll never come off, the Trunchbull shouted back. I have discovered through long experience, Miss Honey, that the ears of small boys are stuck very firmly to their heads. Let him go, Miss Trunchbull, please, begged Miss Honey. You could damage him. You really could. You could wrench them right off. Ears never come off, the Trunchbull shouted. They stretch most marvelously, like these are doing now, but I can assure you they will never come off. Eric was squealing louder than ever and pedaling the air with his legs. Matilda had never before seen a boy, or anyone else like him for that matter, held aloft by his ears alone. Like Miss Honey, she felt sure both ears were going to come off at any moment with all the weight that was on them. The Trunchbull was shouting, The word what is spelled W-H-A-T. Now spell it, you little wart. Eric didn't hesitate. He had learned from watching Rupert a few minutes before that the quicker you answered, the quicker you were released. W-H-A-T, he squealed. Spells what? Still holding him by the ears, the Trunchbull lowered him back into his chair behind his desk. Then she marched back to the front of the class, dusting her hands one against the other like someone who had been handling something rather grimy. That's the way to make them learn, Miss Honey, she said. You take it from me. It's no good just telling them. You've got to hammer it into them. There's nothing like a little twisting and twiddling to encourage them to remember things. It concentrates their minds wonderfully. You could do them permanent damage, Miss Trunchbull, Miss Honey cried out. Oh, I have. I'm quite sure I have, the Trunchbull answered, grinning. Eric's ears will have stretched quite considerably in the last couple of minutes. They'll be much longer now than they were before. There's nothing wrong with that, Miss Honey. It'll give him an interesting pixie look for the rest of his life. But Miss Trunchbull... Oh, do shut up, Miss Honey. You're as wet as any of them. If you can't cope in here, then you can go and find a job in some cotton wool private school for rich brats. When you have been teaching here for as long as I have, you'll realize that it's no good at all being kind to children. Read Nicholas Nickleby, Miss Honey, by Mr. Dickens. Read about Mr. Wackford Squeers, the admirable headmister of Dotheboys. He knew how to handle the little brutes, didn't he? He knew how to use the birch, didn't he? He kept their backside so warm you could have fried eggs and bacon on them. A fine book, that, but I don't suppose this bunch of morons we've got here will ever read it, because by the look of them, they are never going to learn to read anything. I've read it, Matilda said quietly. The Trunchbull flicked her head around and looked carefully at the small girl with dark hair and deep brown eyes sitting in the second row. What did you say? She asked sharply. I said I've read it, Miss Trunchbull. Read what? Nicholas Nickleby, Miss Trunchbull. You are lying to me, madam, the Trunchbull shouted, glaring at Matilda. I doubt there is a single child in the entire school who has read that book, and here you are, an unhatched shrimp, sitting in the lowest form there is, trying to tell me a whopping great lie like that. Why do you do it? You must take me for a fool. Do you take me for a fool, child? Well, Matilda said. Then she hesitated. She would have liked to have said, yes, I jolly well do, but that would have been suicide. Well, she said again, still hesitating, still refusing to say no. The Trunchbull sensed that the child was thinking, and she didn't like it. Stand up when you speak to me, she snapped. What is your name? Matilda stood up and said, My name is Matilda Wormwood, Miss Trunchbull. Wormwood, is it? The Trunchbull said. In that case, you must be the daughter of that man who owns Wormwood Motors. Yes, Miss Trunchbull. He's a crook, the Trunchbull shouted. A week ago he sold me a second-hand car that he said was almost new. I thought he was a splendid little fellow then. But this morning while I was driving that car through the village, the entire engine fell out on the road. The whole thing was filled with sawdust. The man's a thief and a robber. I'll have his skin for sausages. You see if I don't. He's clever at his business, Matilda said. Clever my foot, the Trunchbull shouted. Miss Honey tells me that you are meant to be clever too. Well, madame, I don't like clever people. They are all crooked. You are most certainly crooked. Before I fell out with your father, he told me some very nasty stories about the way you behaved at home. But you'd better not try anything in school, young lady. I shall be keeping a very careful eye on you from now on. Sit down and be quiet. The First Miracle. Matilda sat down again at her desk. The Trunchbull seated herself behind the teacher's table. It was the first time she had sat down during the lesson. Then she reached out a hand and took hold of her water jug. Still holding the jug by the handle, but not lifting it yet, she said, I have never been able to understand why small children are so disgusting. They are the bane of my life. They are like insects. They should be gotten rid of as early as possible. We get rid of flies with fly spray and by hanging up fly paper. I have often thought of inventing a spray for getting rid of small children. How splendid it would be to walk into this classroom with a gigantic spray gun in my hands and start pumping it. Or better still, some huge strips of sticky paper. I would hang them all around the school, and you would all get stuck to them, and that would be the end of it. Wouldn't that be a good idea, Miss Honey? If it's meant to be a joke, headmistress, I don't think it's a very funny one, Miss Honey said from the back of the class. You wouldn't, would you, Miss Honey? The Trunchbull said. And it's not meant to be a joke. My idea of a perfect school, Miss Honey, is one that has no children in it at all. One of these days I shall start up a school like that. I think it will be very successful. The woman's mad, Miss Honey was telling herself. She's round the twist. She's the one who ought to be got rid of. The Trunchbull now lifted the large blue porcelain water jug and poured some water into her glass. And suddenly, with the water, out came the long, slimy newt straight into the glass. Plop! The Trunchbull let out a yell and leapt off her chair, as though a firecracker had gone off underneath her. And now the children also saw the long, slimy yellow-bellied lizard-like creature twisting and turning in the glass, and they squirmed and jumped about as well, shouting, "What is it? Oh, it's disgusting! It's a snake! It's a baby crocodile! It's an alligator!" "Look out, Miss Crunchbull!" cried Lavender. "I'll bet it bites!" The Trunchbull, this mighty female giant, stood there in her green breeches, quivering like a blancmange. She was especially furious with someone had succeeded in making her jump and yell like that because she prided herself on her toughness. She stared at the creature, twisting and wriggling in the glass. Curiously enough, she had never seen a newt before. Natural history was not her strong point. She hadn't the faintest idea what that thing was. It certainly looked extremely unpleasant. Slowly, she sat down again in her chair. She looked at this moment more terrifying than ever before. The fires of fury and hatred were smoldering in her small black eyes. "Matilda!" she barked. "Stand up!" "Who, me?" Matilda said. "What have I done?" "Stand up, you disgusting little cockroach." "I haven't done anything, Miss Trunchbull." "Honestly, I haven't. I've never seen that slimy thing before." "Stand up at once, you filthy little maggot." Reluctantly, Matilda got to her feet. She was in the second row. Lavender was in the row behind her. Feeling a bit guilty, she hadn't intended to get her friend into trouble. On the other hand, she was certainly not about to own up. "You are a vile, repulsive, repellent, malicious little brute," the Trunchbull was shouting. "You are not fit to be in this school. You ought to be behind bars. That's where you ought to be. I shall have you drummed out of this establishment in utter disgrace. I shall have the prefects chase you down the corridor and out the front door with hockey sticks. I shall have the staff escort you home under armed guard, and then I shall make absolutely sure you are sent to a reformatory for delinquent girls for the minimum of 40 years. The Trunchbull was in such a rage that her face had taken on a boiled color, and little flecks of froth were gathering at the corners of her mouth. But she was not the only one who was losing her cool. Matilda was beginning to see red. She didn't in the least mind being accused of having done something she had actually done. She could see the justice of that. It was, however, a totally new experience for her to be accused of a crime that she definitely had not committed. She had had absolutely nothing to do with that beastly creature in the glass. "By golly," she thought, "that rotten Trunchbull isn't going to pin this on me." "I did not do it!" she screamed. "Oh, yes, you did," the Trunchbull roared back. "Nobody else could have thought up a trick like that. Your father was right to warn me about you." The woman seemed to have lost control of herself completely. She was ranting like a maniac. "You are finished in this school, young lady," she shouted. "You are finished everywhere. I shall personally see to it that you are put away in a place where not even the crows can land their droppings on you. You will probably never see the light of day again." "I'm telling you I didn't do it," Matilda screamed. "I've never even seen a creature like that in my life." "You have put a crocodile in my drinking water," the Trunchbull yelled back. "There is no worse crime in the world against the headmistress. Now sit down and don't say a word. Go on, sit down at once." "But I'm telling you," Matilda shouted, refusing to sit down. "I'm telling you to shut up," the Trunchbull roared. "If you don't shut up at once and sit down, I shall remove my belt and let you have it with the end that has the buckle." Slowly Matilda sat down. Oh, the rottenness of it all. The unfairness. How dare they expel her for something she hadn't done? Matilda felt herself getting angrier and angrier and angrier. So unbearably angry that something was bound to explode inside her very soon. The newt was still squirming in the tall glass of water. It looked horribly uncomfortable. The glass was not big enough for it. Matilda glared at the Trunchbull. How she hated her! She glared at the glass with the newt in it. She longed to march up and grab the glass and tip the contents, newt and all, over the Trunchbull's head. She trembled to think what the Trunchbull would do to her if she did that. The Trunchbull was sitting behind the teacher's table, staring with a mixture of horror and fascination at the newt wriggling in the glass. Matilda's eyes were also riveted on the glass, and now, quite slowly, there began to creep over Matilda a most extraordinary and peculiar feeling. The feeling was mostly in the eyes. A kind of electricity seemed to be gathering inside them. A sense of power was brewing in those eyes of hers. A sense of great strength was settling itself deep inside her eyes. But there was also another feeling which was something else altogether, and which she could not understand. It was like flashes of lightning. Little waves of lightning seemed to be flashing out of her eyes. Her eyeballs were beginning to get hot, as though vast energy was building up somewhere inside them. It was an amazing sensation. She kept her eyes steadily on the glass, and now the power was concentrating itself in one small part of each eye and growing stronger and stronger, and it felt as though millions of tiny little invisible arms with hands on them were shooting out of her eyes toward the glass she was staring at. "Tip it," Matilda whispered. "Tip it over." She saw the glass wobble. It actually tilted backwards a fraction of an inch, then righted itself again. She kept pushing at it with all those millions of invisible little arms and hands that were reaching out from her eyes, feeling the power that was flashing straight from the little two black dots in the very centers of her eyeballs. "Tip it," she whispered again. "Tip it over." Once more the glass wobbled. She pushed harder still, willing her eyes to shoot out more power. And then, very slowly, so slowly she could hardly see it happening, the glass began to lean backwards, farther and farther and farther backwards, until it was balancing on just one edge of its base, and there it teetered for a few seconds before finally toppling over and falling with a sharp tinkle onto the desktop. The water in it and the squirming newt splashed out all over Miss Trunchbull's enormous bosom. The headmistress let out a yell that must have rattled every window pane in the building, and for the second time in the last 5 minutes she shot out of her chair like a rocket. The newt clutched desperately at the cotton smock where it covered the great chest, and there it clung with its little claw-like feet. The Trunchbull looked down and saw it, and she bellowed even louder. With a swipe of her hand, and she sent the creature flying across the classroom. It landed on the floor beside Lavender's desk, and very quickly she ducked down and picked it up and put it in her pencil box for another time. A newt, she decided, was a useful thing to have around. The Trunchbull, her face more like a boiled ham than ever, was standing before the class, quivering with fury. Her massive bosom was heaving in and out, and the splash of water down the front of it made a dark, wet patch that had probably soaked right through to her skin. "Who did it?" she roared. "Come on! Own up! Step forward! You won't escape this time! Who is responsible for this dirty job? Who pushed over this glass?" Nobody answered. The whole room remained silent as a tomb. "Matilda," she roared, "it was you! I know it was you!" Matilda, in the second row, sat very still and said nothing. A strange feeling of serenity and confidence was sweeping over her, and all of a sudden she found that she was frightened by nobody in the world. With the power of her eyes alone, she had compelled a glass of water to tip and spill its contents over this horrible mistress, and anybody who could do that could do anything. "Speak up, you clotted carbuncle," roared the Trunchbull. "Admit that you did it." Matilda looked right back into the flashing eyes of this infuriated female giant and sat with total calmness. "I have not moved away from my desk, Miss Trunchbull, since the lesson began. I can say no more." Suddenly, the entire class seemed to rise up against the headmistress. "She didn't move!" they cried out. "Matilda didn't move. Nobody moved. You must have knocked it over yourself." "I most certainly did not knock it over myself," roared the Trunchbull. "How dare you suggest such a thing like that? Speak up, Miss Honey. You must have seen everything. Who knocked over my glass?" "None of the children did, Miss Trunchbull," Miss Honey answered. "I can vouch for it, that nobody has moved from his or her desk all the time you've been here, except for Nigel, and he has not moved from his corner." Miss Trunchbull glared at Miss Honey. Miss Honey met her gaze without flinching. "I am telling you the truth, headmistress," she said. "You must have knocked it over without knowing it. That sort of thing is easy to do." "I am fed up with your useless bunch of midgets," roared the Trunchbull. "I refuse to waste any more of my precious time in here." And with that she marched out of the classroom, slamming the door behind her. In the stunned silence that followed, Miss Honey walked up to the front of the class and stood behind her table. "Phew," she said. "I think we've had enough school for one day, don't you? The class is dismissed. You may all go out to the playground and wait for your parents to come and take you home." The second miracle. Matilda did not join the rush to get out of the classroom. After the other children had all disappeared, she remained at her desk, quiet and thoughtful. She knew she had to tell somebody about what had happened with the glass. She couldn't possibly keep a gigantic secret like that all bottled up inside her. What she needed was just one person, one wise and sympathetic grown-up who could help her to understand the feeling of this extraordinary happening. Neither her mother nor her father would be of any use at all. If they believed her story, and it was doubtful they would, they almost certainly would fail to realize what an astounding event it was that had taken place in the classroom that afternoon. On the spur of the moment, Matilda decided that the one person she would like to confide in was Miss Honey. Matilda and Miss Honey were now the only two left in the classroom. Miss Honey had seated herself at her table and was rifling through some papers. She looked up and said, "Well, Matilda, aren't you going outside with the others?" Matilda said, "Please, may I talk to you for a moment?" "Of course you may. What's troubling you?" "Something very peculiar has happened to me, Miss Honey." Miss Honey became instantly alert. Ever since the two disastrous meetings she had had recently about Matilda, the first with the headmistress and the second with the dreadful Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood, Miss Honey had been thinking a great deal about this child and wondering how she could help her. And now, here was Matilda sitting in the classroom with a curiously exalted look on her face and asking if she could have a private talk. Miss Honey had never seen her looking so wide-eyed and peculiar before. "Yes, Matilda," she said. "Tell me what has happened to you that is so peculiar." "Miss Trunchbull isn't going to expel me, is she?" Matilda asked. "Because it wasn't me who put that creature in her jug of water. I promise you it wasn't." "I know it wasn't," Miss Honey said. "Am I going to be expelled?" "I think not," Miss Honey said. "The headmistress simply got a little overexcited, that's all." "Good," Matilda said. "But that isn't what I want to talk to you about." "What do you want to talk to me about, Matilda?" "I want to talk to you about the glass of water with the creature in it," Matilda said. "You saw it spilling all over Mr. Trunchbull, didn't you?" "I did indeed." "Well, Miss Honey, I didn't touch it. I never went near it." "I know you didn't," Miss Honey said. "You heard me telling the headmistress that it couldn't possibly have been you." "Ah, but it was me, Miss Honey," Matilda said. "That's exactly what I want to talk to you about." Miss Honey paused and looked carefully at the child. "I don't think I quite follow you," she said. "I got so angry at being accused of something I hadn't done that I made it happen." "You made what happen, Matilda?" "I made the glass tip over." "I still don't quite understand what you mean," Miss Honey said gently. "I did it with my eyes," Matilda said. "I was staring at it and wishing it to tip, and then my eyes went all hot and funny, and some sort of power came out of them, and the glass just toppled over." Miss Honey continued to look steadily at Matilda through her steel-rimmed spectacles, and Matilda looked back at her just as steadily. "I'm still not following you," Miss Honey said. "Do you mean you actually willed the glass to tip over?" "Yes," Matilda said, "with my eyes." Miss Honey was silent for a moment. She did not think Matilda was meaning to tell a lie. It was more likely that she was simply allowing her vivid imagination to run away with her. "You mean you were sitting where you are now, and you told the glass to topple over, and it did?" "Something like that, Miss Honey. Yes." "If you did that, then it was just about the greatest miracle a person has ever performed since the time of Jesus." "I did it, Miss Honey." "It is extraordinary," thought Miss Honey, "how often small children have flights of fancy like this." She decided to put an end to it as gently as possible. Could you do it again? She asked, not unkindly. I don't know, Matilda said, but I think I might be able to. Miss Honey moved the now empty glass to the middle of the table. Should I put water in it? She asked, smiling a little. I don't think it matters, Matilda said. Very well, then. Go ahead and tip it over. It may take some time. Take all the time you want, Miss Honey said. I'm in no hurry. Matilda, sitting in the second row about 10 feet away from Miss Honey, put her elbows on the desk and cupped her face in her hands, and this time she gave the order right at the beginning. Tip, glass, tip, she ordered, but her lips didn't move and she made no sound. She simply shouted the words inside her mind, and now she concentrated the whole of her mind and her brain and her will up into her eyes, and once again, but more quickly than before, she felt the electricity gathering and the power was beginning to surge, and the hotness was coming into the eyeballs, and the millions of tiny invisible arms with hands on them were shooting out towards the glass, and without making any sound at all, she kept on shouting inside her head for the glass to go over. She saw it wobble, then it tilted, then it toppled right over and fell with a tinkle on the tabletop, not 12 inches from Miss Honey's folded arms. Miss Honey's mouth dropped open and her eyes stretched so wide you could see the whites all around. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. The shock of seeing the miracle performed had struck her dumb. She gaped at the glass, leaning well away from it now, as though it might be a dangerous thing. Then slowly she lifted her head and looked at Matilda. She saw the child white in the face, as white as paper, trembling all over, the eyes glazed, staring straight ahead, and seeing nothing. The whole face was transfigured, the eyes round and bright, and she was sitting there speechless, quite beautiful in a blaze of silence. Miss Honey waited, trembling a little herself, and watching the child as she slowly stirred herself back into consciousness, and then suddenly, click, went her face into a look of almost seraphic calm. I'm all right, she said and smiled. I'm quite all right, Miss Honey, so don't be alarmed. You seem so far away, Miss Honey whispered, awestruck. Oh, I was flying past the stars on silver wings, Matilda said. It was wonderful. Miss Honey was still gazing at the child in absolute wonderment, as though she were the creation, the beginning of the world, the first morning. It went much quicker this time, Matilda said quietly. It's not possible, Miss Honey was gasping. I don't believe it. I simply don't believe it. She closed her eyes and kept them closed for quite a while, and when she opened them again, it seemed as though she had gathered herself together. Would you like to come back and have tea at my cottage? She asked. Oh, I'd love to, Matilda said. Good. Gather up your things, and I'll meet you outside in a couple of minutes. You won't tell anyone about this thing that I did, will you, Miss Honey? I wouldn't dream of it, Miss Honey said. Miss Honey's cottage. Miss Honey joined Matilda outside the school gates, and the two of them walked in silence through the village high street. They passed the greengrocer with his window full of apples and oranges, and the butcher with bloody lumps of meat on display and naked chickens hanging up, and the small bank, and the grocery store, and the electrical shop, and then they came out at the other side of the village onto the narrow country road where there were no people anymore, and very few motor cars. And now that they were alone, Matilda all of a sudden became wildly animated. It seemed as though a valve had burst inside her and a great gush of energy was being released. She trotted beside Miss Honey with wild little hops, and her fingers flew as if she could scatter them to the four winds, and her words went off like fireworks with terrific speed. It was Miss Honey this, and Miss Honey that, and Miss Honey I do. Miss Honey, I do honestly feel I could move almost anything in the world, not just tipping over glasses and little things like that. I feel I could topple tables and chairs, Miss Honey, even when people are sitting in the chairs. I think I could push them over, and bigger things too, much bigger things than chairs and tables. I only have to take a moment to get my eye strong, and then I can push it out, this strongness, at anything at all, so long as I'm staring at it hard enough. I have to stare at it very hard, Miss Honey, very, very hard, and then I can feel it all happening behind my eyes, and my eyes get hot, just as though they were burning. But I don't mind that in the least. And, Miss Honey, calm yourself down, child. Calm yourself down, Miss Honey said. Let us not get ourselves too worked up so early in the proceedings. But you do think it's interesting, don't you, Miss Honey? Oh, it's interesting, all right, Miss Honey said. It is more than interesting, but we must tread very carefully from now on, Matilda. Why must we tread carefully, Miss Honey? Because we are playing with mysterious forces, my child, that we know nothing about. I do not think they are evil. They may be good. They may even be divine. But whether they are or not, let us handle them carefully. These were wise words from a wise old bird, but Matilda was too steamed up to see it that way. I don't see why we have to be so careful, she said, still hopping about. I'm trying to explain to you, Miss Honey said patiently, that we are dealing with the unknown. It is an unexplainable thing. The right word for it is a phenomenon. It is a phenomenon. Am I a phenomenon? Matilda asked. It is quite possible that you are, Miss Honey said, but I'd rather you think about it yourself as anything in particular. But I'd rather you didn't think about yourself as anything in particular at the moment. What I thought we might do is to explore this phenomenon a little further, just the two of us together, but making sure we take things very carefully all the time. You want me to do some more of it then, Miss Honey? That is what I'm tempted to suggest, Miss Honey said cautiously. Goody good, Matilda said. I myself, Miss Honey said, am probably far more bowled over by what you did than you are, and I am trying to find some reasonable explanation. Such as what? Matilda asked. Such as whether or not it's got something to do with the fact that you are quite exceptionally precocious. What exactly does that word mean? Matilda said. A precocious child, Miss Honey said, is one that shows amazing intelligence early on. You are an unbelievably precocious child. Am I really? Matilda asked. Of course you are. You must be aware of that. Look at your reading. Look at your mathematics. I suppose you're right, Matilda said. Miss Honey marveled at the child's lack of conceit and self-consciousness. I can't help wondering, she said, whether this sudden ability that has come to you of being able to move an object without touching it, whether it might not have something to do with your brain power. You mean there might not be room in my head for all those brains, so something has to push out? That's not quite what I mean, Miss Honey said, smiling, but whatever happens, and I say it again, we must tread carefully from now on. I have not forgotten that strange and distant glimmer on your face after you tipped over the last glass. Do you think doing it could actually hurt me? Is that what you're thinking, Miss Honey? It made you feel pretty peculiar, didn't it? It made me feel lovely, Matilda said. For a moment or two, I was flying past the stars on Silver's wings. I told you that. And shall I tell you something else, Miss Honey? It was easier the second time. Much, much easier. I think it's like anything else. The more you practice, the easier it gets. Miss Honey was walking slowly so that the small child could keep up with her without trotting too fast, and it was very peaceful out there on the narrow road now that the village was behind them. It was one of those golden autumn afternoons, and there were blackberries and splashes of old man's beards in the hedges, and the hawthorn berries were ripening scarlet for the birds when the cold winter came along. There were tall trees here and there on either side, oak and sycamore and ash, and occasionally a sweet chestnut. Miss Honey, wishing to change the subject for the moment, gave the names of all these to Matilda and taught her how to recognize them by the shape of their leaves and the pattern of the bark on their trunks. Matilda took all this in and stored the knowledge away carefully in her mind. They came finally to a gap in the hedge of the left-hand side of the road where there was a 5-barred gate. "This way," Miss Honey said, and she opened the gate and led Matilda through and closed it again. They were now walking along a narrow lane that was no more than a rutted cart track. There was a high hedge of hazel on either side, and you could see clusters of ripe brown nuts in their green jackets. The squirrels would be collecting them all very soon, Miss Honey said, and storing them away carefully for the bleak months ahead. You mean you live down here?" Matilda asked. "I do," Miss Honey replied, but she said no more. Matilda had never once stopped to think about where Miss Honey might be living. She had always regarded her purely as a teacher, a person who turned up out of nowhere and taught at the school and then went away again. Do any of us children, she wondered, ever stop to ask ourselves where our teachers go when school is over for the day? Do we wonder if they live alone, or if there is a mother at home, or a sister, or a husband? "Do you live all by yourself, Miss Honey?" she asked. "Yes," Miss Honey said, "very much so." They were walking over the deep sun-baked mud tracks of a lane, and you had to watch where you put your feet in if you didn't want to twist your ankle. There were a few small birds around in the hazel branches, but that was all. "It's just a farm laborer's cottage," Miss Honey said. "You mustn't expect too much of it. We're nearly there." They came to a small green gate half buried in the hedge on the right and almost hidden by the overhanging hazel branches. Miss Honey paused with one hand on the gate and said, "There it is. That's where I live." Matilda saw a narrow dirt path leading up to a tiny red brick cottage. The cottage was so small it looked more like a doll's house than a human dwelling. The bricks it was built of were old and crumbly and very pale red. It had a gray slate roof and one small chimney, and there were 2 little windows at the front. Each window was no larger than a sheet of tabloid newspaper, and there was clearly no upstairs to the place. On either side of the path there was a wilderness of nettles and blackberry thorns and long brown grass. An enormous oak tree overshadowed the cottage. Its massive spreading branches seemed to be enfolding and embracing the tiny building, and perhaps hiding it as well from the rest of the world. Miss Honey, with one hand on the gate, which she had not yet opened, turned to Matilda and said, "A poet called Dylan Thomas once wrote some lines that I think of every time I walk up this path." Matilda waited, and Miss Honey, in a rather wonderful slow voice, began reciting the poem. "Never and never my girl writing fear and near, in the land of the Heartstone tales and spelled asleep. Fear or believe that the wolf in the sheep-white hood, loping and bleeding roughly and blithely shall leap, my dear, out of a lair in the flocked leaves in the dew-dipped year, to eat your heart in the house in the rosy wood." There was a moment of silence, and Matilda, who had never before heard great romantic poetry spoken aloud, was profoundly moved. "It's like music," she whispered. "It is music," Miss Honey said, and then, as though embarrassed at having revealed such a secret part of herself, she quickly pushed open the gate and walked up the path. Matilda hung back. She was a bit frightened of this place now. It seemed so unreal and remote and fantastic, and so totally away from this earth. It was like an illustration in Grimm or Hans Andersen. It was the house where the poor woodcutter lived with Hansel and Gretel, and where Red Riding Hood's grandmother lived, and it was also the house of the 7 dwarfs and the 3 bears and all the rest of them. It was straight out of a fairy tale. "Come along, my dear," Miss Honey called back, and Matilda followed her up the path. The front door was covered with flaky green paint, and there was no keyhole. Miss Honey simply lifted the latch and pushed open the door and went in. Although she was not a tall woman, she had to stoop low to get through the doorway. Matilda went after her and found herself in what seemed to be a dark, narrow tunnel. "You can come through into the kitchen and help me make the tea," Miss Honey said, and she led the way along the tunnel into the kitchen. That is as if you could call it a kitchen. It was not much bigger than a good-sized clothes cupboard, and there was one small window in the back wall with a sink under the window, but there were no taps over the sink. Against another wall there was a shelf, presumably for preparing food, and there was a single cupboard above the shelf. On the shelf itself there stood a Primus stove, a saucepan, and a half bottle of milk. A Primus is a little camping stove that you fill with paraffin, and you light it at the top, and then you pump it to get pressure for the flame. You can get me some water while I light the Primus, Miss Honey said. The well is out at the back. Take the bucket. Here it is. You'll find a rope in the well. Just hook the bucket onto the end of the rope and lower it down. But don't fall in yourself. Matilda, more bemused now than ever, took the bucket and carried it out into the back garden. The well had a little wooden roof over it and a simple winding device, and there was the rope dangling down in the dark, bottomless hole. Matilda pulled up the rope and hooked the handle on the bucket onto the end of it. Then she lowered it until she heard a splash and the rope went slack. She pulled it up again, and lo and behold, there was water in the bucket. Is this enough? She asked, carrying it in. Just about, Miss Honey said. I don't suppose you've ever done that before. Never, Matilda said. It's fun. How do you get enough water for your bath? I don't take a bath, Miss Honey said. I wash standing up. I get a bucket full of water and I heat it on this little stove, and I strip and wash myself all over. Do you honestly do that? Matilda asked. Of course I do, Miss Honey said. Every poor person in England used to wash that way until not so very long ago, and they didn't have a Primus. They had to heat the water over the fire in the hearth. Are you poor, Miss Honey? Yes, Miss Honey said. Very. It's a good little stove, isn't it? The Primus was roaring away with a powerful blue flame, and already the water in the saucepan was beginning to bubble. Miss Honey got a teapot from the cupboard and put some tea leaves into it. She also found half a small loaf of brown bread. She cut 2 thin slices, and then, from a plastic container, she took some margarine and spread it out on the bread. Margarine, Matilda thought. She really must be poor. Miss Honey found a tray, and on it she put 2 mugs, the teapot, the half bottle of milk, and a plate with 2 slices of bread. I'm afraid I don't have any sugar, she said. I never use it. That's all right, Matilda said. In her wisdom, she seemed to be aware of the delicacy of the situation, and she was taking great care not to say anything to embarrass her companion. Let's have it in the sitting room, Miss Honey said, picking up the tray and leading the way out of the kitchen and down the dark little tunnel into the room at the front. Matilda followed her, but just inside the doorway of the so-called sitting room, she stopped and stared around her in absolute amazement. The room was as small and square and bare as a prison cell. The pale daylight that entered came from a single tiny window in the front wall, but there were no curtains. The only objects in the entire room were 2 upturned wooden boxes to serve as chairs, and a third box between them for a table. That was all. There were no pictures on the wall, no carpet on the floor, only rough, unpolished wooden planks, and there were gaps between the planks where dust and bits of grime had gathered. The ceiling was so low that with a jump, Matilda could nearly touch it with her fingertips. The walls were white, but the whiteness didn't look like paint. Matilda rubbed her palm against it, and a white powder came onto her skin. It was whitewash, the cheap stuff that is used in cowsheds and stables and hen houses. Matilda was appalled. Was this really where her neat and trimly dressed schoolteacher lived? Was this all she had to come back to after a day's work? It was unbelievable. And what was the reason for it? There was something very strange going on around here, surely. Miss Honey put the tray on one of the upturned boxes. Sit down, my dear, sit down, she said, and we'll have a nice hot cup of tea. Help yourself to bread. Both slices are for you. I never eat anything when I get home. I have a good old tuck in at the school lunch, and that keeps me going until the next morning. Matilda perched herself carefully on an upturned box, and more out of politeness than anything else, she took a slice of bread and margarine and started to eat it. At home, she would have been having butter toast and strawberry jam and probably a piece of sponge cake to round it off. And yet, this was somehow far more fun. There was a mystery here in this house, a great mystery. There was no doubt about that, and Matilda was longing to find out what it was. Miss Honey poured the tea and added a little milk to both cups. She appeared to be not in the least ill ease, sitting on an upturned box in the bare room and drinking tea out of a mug that she balanced on her knees. You know, she said, I've been thinking very hard about what you did with that glass. It is a great power you have been given, my child. You know that. Yes, Miss Honey, I do, Matilda said, chewing her bread and margarine. So far as I know, Miss Honey went on, nobody else in the history of the world has been able to compel an object to move without touching it or blowing on it or using any outside help at all. Matilda nodded, but said nothing. This fascinating thing, Miss Honey said, would be to find out the real limit of this power of yours. Oh, I know you think you can move just about anything there is, but I have my doubts about that. I'd love to try something really huge, Matilda said. What about distance? Miss Honey asked. Would you always have to be close to the thing you were pushing? I simply don't know, Matilda said, but it'd be nice to find out.